An argument I regularly make on this channel is that a Russian victory in Ukraine is a risk for European and American national security. But then in the same video, I'm zooming way into the map to show a 50-meter advance the Russians made last week using pickup trucks and ATVs, taking 80% casualties along the way. So a logical question then is, if Russia is getting stuck in eastern Ukraine, why should NATO be worried about them at all? So today I'm taking the other side of these arguments and asking that question and more of Peter Dickinson. So here's the deal. Peter and I share a lot of similar views on this conflict and the ongoing peace process. So we thought, rather than just hammering the same handful of items that haven't really changed at all, we'd take a different approach, and I'd ask some of the questions or points of contention I often see raised about the peace process and/or our continued support of Ukraine. Peter's the editor of Ukraine Alert at the Atlantic Council and the chief editor of Business Ukraine magazine, and he joins us today from Kyiv. You can follow Peter's work at the Atlantic Council and on X. Both will be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Peter, thank you so much for taking the time, sir. I know I, at the last minute here, brought up this idea that maybe I'll throw out some alternative points of view to kind of steelman some of this stuff around the negotiation process. So I appreciate you being a good sport and taking this head on, man.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's good to join you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. You've done some incredible work. We've cited your work in videos, so thank you very much for all you do. But right now, we were getting ready to talk about the peace process. And one of the frustrating things, I'm sure preaching to the choir here, is it doesn't seem like there's been very much change in recent weeks or months. It's been, like 7-8 months now of waiting for this breakthrough in the peace process, and it's not coming. So I wanted to maybe look at some of the arguments that I am seeing online against all of this and just see how you might address that. Like, for one, it does not look like Ukraine has the military capability to retake their lost territory. If that's the case, why not just settle for peace now?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that Ukraine Ukraine can't realistically liberate the whole country now, and they accept that. I mean, they more or less say that. They sometimes couch it in certain, in a diplomatic fashion, but they essentially said that for some time now. Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials, they recognise that they're going to have to accept the long-term occupation of the areas that are currently held by Russia. That's around 20% of the country will be controlled by the Kremlin for the foreseeable future. The big issue for Ukrainians is not so much the territorial aspects. They already agree to that. Now, they don't want to officially cede that land, and they don't want to hand over other land that Russia hasn't been able to conquer. So, they're the two sticking points territorially. But, if we take a step back and look at the big picture of, the whole invasion, Ukraine's basically said, okay, yeah, we recognize this is the reality. We're not going to get that territory back. For Ukraine, the real issue here is long-term security, how to end the war in a way that has a sustainable peace in place that gives the country a chance to go forward, to survive really, and to move on. They are well aware, they're acutely aware, that Russia's goal is to take over the country and either end Ukrainian statehood or to have a sort of pseudo-state, a vassal, a sort of Belarus Mark II in place. And they see what's happening in the areas that are controlled by the Kremlin at the moment. They see the very harsh Russification policies that are underway, the eradication of all Ukrainian national identity. So they're under no illusions. They're really saying, well, if we don't have a long-term peace plan in place that's credible to the Kremlin first and foremost, this is just going to restart slightly further down the line. And if that were to happen, Ukraine wouldn't benefit from the current international support, most likely, because the international community would be very jaded. They'd be used to the idea, okay, again, Russia's invading Ukraine. They wouldn't be shocked by it. There wouldn't be the outpouring of support that Ukraine received in 2022 and, that continues to this day. And they would be in a very, very weakened position, whereas presumably Russia would have been able to rearm somewhat and to regroup and to, learn lessons. So if Ukrainians can't get that security, can't get that sort of long-term security in place, a lot of people I speak to here in Kyiv say, well, it's better for us to just keep fighting now. As horrific as that is, at least we know what we're doing now. We're able to defend ourselves. We have a significant amount of international support that we can rely on, and the Russians haven't been able to sort of get their breath back and regain their strength. Just to pause it for the Russians doesn't make any sense for the Ukrainians.
You made a great point there and it lands about how this would not be good for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. But why should anyone outside of Ukraine care about that? I mean, everything in terms of security guarantees, it has to be someone else, another country, another group of countries. But everything you just described is how Ukraine is going to have to deal with this Russian threat on their border. Why would anybody step in? Why should anybody step in and run that risk of a war with Russia to provide security?
Well, I think the short answer is they're not going to step in and provide security guarantees. I mean, I think the term security guarantee is probably misleading. I mean, I use it. We all use it. It's the de facto accepted term, but it's kind of misleading because a security guarantee means you're going to fight, right? I mean, it means you're going to step in and fight. And I don't think anybody, certainly no one in Ukraine, and I don't think anyone realistically in the West, in Europe or America, seriously thinks that either any NATO members are going to step in and fight Russia. I mean, I think that's been pretty conclusively demonstrated over the last 3.5 years. They're just not going to do that. So, I mean, I think we're really talking about security support, long-term security commitments, perhaps would be a better term. Realistically, the most solid Ukrainian, security guarantee for Ukraine is the Ukrainian army. So, one of the things that the Ukrainian officials are now saying more and more, and I think the Europeans recognise this as well, is that the key to any long-term security is going to be strengthening the Ukrainian military and making sure that it's on a footing that it can defend itself long term. One of the they're not dependent on the changing political winds in different European capitals, the latest election or whatever it may be. That they have locked in solid long-term support. And that they have a development also of cooperation with different European partners. That means cooperation militarily in terms of simply, working together as militaries, perhaps also with an air shield component, an aviation component of some sort of a cooperation, but also manufacturing, production of weapons, support for Ukraine's military industrial complex and sort of joint projects in that sense. Because the key is going to be, who's going to do the fighting here? It's going to be Ukraine. But to come back to the main point you made, why does it matter to anyone else? It's all about what Russia's going to do next. I mean, I think it's extremely naive to think that Putin could achieve his goals in Ukraine to establish Russian control over Ukraine, whatever form that took. A puppet government or complete direct control, as annexation, as it were, as we're seeing it in the south and east of the country. They're already essentially, that's not a puppet regime, that's Russia as far as the Russians are concerned. So whatever format it took, if Russia achieves its goals and they control Ukraine, Putin would be his invasion would be legitimized. He would be massively emboldened. The international community, the global south, as it were, would flock to him. They would see him as the next big thing, the victor, the man who's going to determine the future. He would also control Ukraine. He would control the Ukrainian army. Now he would then have under his control the Russian and Ukrainian army. So the first and second most powerful militaries by far in Europe, and the only two militaries that have real-time combat experience. So in that scenario, the idea that Putin would just stop and not go any further is pretty fanciful. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that he would go further, and it's equally obvious that there's not really a lot that would be able to stop him. I mean, I think the Poles have a serious army, the Finns have a serious army. Beyond those two, there's really not a lot out there that I think would offer any serious obstacles to the Russians, and it's questionable to what extent either of those two countries would be able to fight. And would NATO stand up? I mean, I wouldn't want to put money on NATO's Article 5 at the moment. I don't think many people in Europe would either. So, you're looking at a scenario where if Ukraine were to fall, the consequences for Europe would be catastrophic. And at an absolute bare minimum, all of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and arguably the whole of Europe, would have to dramatically increase their defence spending. So, it really makes more sense for them to spend that money now on Ukraine while Ukraine's still in the fight, and Ukraine can do the fighting for them, for want of a better word. Let's be frank, than to wait until they're facing a much stronger Russia from a much weaker position themselves, where they're going to have to spend that money anyway, and probably a lot more.
I want to dig into that future threat of Russia, because I think sometimes it's hard to connect those dots, where we look at the, quite frankly, lack of progress by Russia in the East, and we're talking about how they've gained 400 square kilometers total in the month of August or something, across all of Ukraine. It's a small small movement. Like, you really have to zoom into the maps to see how much territory Russia has taken in the last even few months. How do we go from that and Russia losing thousands of tanks, a significant portion of their air force, a lot of senior leadership? How do you go from that to say, but they would be a threat to NATO or Poland? Because it seems like right now they're struggling even against Ukraine without, direct NATO backing.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. I mean, it's that sort of obvious. It's an obvious fact that stares you in the face when we're talking about this threat, and it's the reality. But it can be misleading. I think the main danger here is to underestimate how hard Ukraine is fighting. I mean, Ukraine has an army now of around a million men and women in arms. And they're fighting extremely fiercely, and they're suffering. They're taking very heavy losses. Not only the Russians that are taking heavy losses, Ukraine's losses are also catastrophic. They are significantly less than the Russians. All indicators point to, but they're suffering huge amounts. So it's a bit the fact that Russia's not making huge advances, not because they're not trying and not because they don't have offensive capabilities, it's because Ukrainians are fighting so hard and so well, frankly. I mean, they've adapted extremely well, particularly in terms of their drone warfare capabilities. And they also have the advantage of fighting for their homeland. They know what they're fighting for. There's no question. Ukrainians are exhausted, but they know very well that they're fighting to defend their country and to fight. They're fighting for national survival. So it's perhaps misleading to think, oh well, the Russians aren't a force. They are a serious force, but they've come into contact now with the only other force, arguably, in Europe that could create serious obstacles to them. I think that's the key point. Now, if that were to fall, and Ukrainians are not superhumans, at some point, they will break. That's the reality. And if that were to happen, again, you would have Putin controlling the two biggest armies in Europe with incredibly sophisticated, modern combat experience, faced with not a lot of resistance from the rest of Europe. But it's still a question whether they could put across any sort of a realistic threat in a conventional war against NATO. But I think the second misleading aspect here is the idea that Russia cannot defeat NATO in a conventional war. Putin has no need to defeat NATO in a conventional war. What Putin's goal would be, I anticipate, is he would look to discredit NATO. He would look to undermine and discredit NATO as an alliance, which is really all he needs to do. NATO has no soldiers of its own. NATO is an alliance, and the members are the force. The members make the decisions. NATO itself has no supreme commander that can order even one soldier into battle. So it really depends on its constituent parts, on the member states. Now, if Putin were to be emboldened, to be encouraged by victory in Ukraine, and he wished to test NATO, I believe what he would try and do is he would launch some sort of a minor operation along the eastern borders, perhaps in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or Finland, something similar to what we saw in Ukraine going back to 2014, where the Russians used soldiers disguised as locals, where they formed these sort of hybrid attacks. And they pretended they weren't involved, and then when it was convenient, as in Crimea, they said, yes, of course it's us, and they announced it was them. In East Ukraine, for 8 years, they maintained this charade that it wasn't them. But I think if they were to do that in the border areas, let's say a small town in Estonia, let's say, for example, then the West would be faced with a scenario where NATO territory had been breached, NATO was under attack, part of NATO had been occupied by the Russians. That would be clear to all NATO members, and they would be asked very simply: do we go to war with Russia for this? Are we going to risk World War III for a couple of Estonian villages? And frankly, I think it's very unlikely that NATO would agree to go to war with Russia on that. They would make a lot of noise. They would hold all sorts of consultations. They would express their grave concern, and they would probably be talk of sanctions and other measures. But would they go to war? I doubt it. And at that point, when they don't do it, when NATO is shown to be unwilling to cross that red line, NATO itself becomes redundant. I mean, it wouldn't fold overnight, but every single member of NATO would get the memo, as it were. They would draw the logical conclusions. NATO's collective security, which is all NATO really represents essentially in the final analysis, doesn't work. So then you'd have different individual countries looking to cut deals with Russia. The Baltic states, first of all, the Poles, perhaps, of course, Hungary and Slovakia are already probably ready to do so. And so you'd have a scenario where Europe would be divided. And then once it's divided, then it gets conquered. That's the kind of scenario I see unfolding in the years ahead, potentially. And it doesn't involve a direct, full-scale conventional war between NATO and Russia, because Russia would lose that war. Again, NATO, Russia doesn't need to defeat NATO on the battlefield. All it needs to do is discredit NATO, and I think it's got all the tools in place to do that if Putin chooses to go that way. And if he's not stopped in Ukraine, I think it would be very strange if he didn't at least test NATO.
That's a good point. So to that end, what are we supposed to do here? Because we've tried sanctions. There has been a influx of military equipment that's definitely died down as of late, especially coming from the United States. But it looks like the military option is not getting the job done. Sanctions is not getting the job done. And I think that's why the argument right now is being made, make room for peace. Let's at least see what happens here. What else can be done to try to bring about, what have we not tried? Or have we exhausted all options?
Well, I think we're very, very far from having exhausted all options. I mean, I think if we look at there's two elements here. There's the sanctions element, there's the military element. Neither of which has been taken to its, to its maximum potential, let's say. I mean, if we look at the economic side of it, sanctions, there's a huge amount that can be done to make life more difficult for Putin. He doesn't like the sanctions now, but clearly it's not enough to stop him or to change his broad plans. But they clearly don't like what's going on at the moment. The Russian economy is not in great shape, and the Russians always mention the need to lift sanctions in all talks and discussions that they have with the West. So clearly they're not as calm, as relaxed about sanctions as they sometimes like to suggest. They like to say, "Oh, sanctions are great, we've not a problem with it," but they always say, "Yeah, we must remove sanctions." So sanctions have some role, but they could do a lot more. There's a lot more that could be done in terms of secondary sanctions, in terms of targeting Russia's shadow fleet, in terms of targeting Russia's partners and clients. As we've seen, actually, one of the few things that Trump has done, in fact, is to target the Indians. What a key thing that could be done more, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it happen, would be efforts to bring the price of oil down further. Working with the Saudis perhaps to bring it down, because that would really have a big impact on the Russians. That would make life very uncomfortable for them. But I think that, whatever we did in terms of finance and economics, none of those factors are going to be decisive for the Russians. We've got to understand that Putin is not waging, a sort of minor political war here. He's waging a very historic campaign as he sees it. He believes that he is reversing the world order. He's dismantling, rather, the world order that was established after 1991. He's kind of reversing the Soviet collapse. He's righting what he sees as a big historic injustice. He's re-establishing Russia's place as one, as one of the leading great powers in the world. And the key part of that is erasing Ukraine. He's getting rid of what he sees as the sort of anomaly of Ukrainian statehood that should never have happened. It was an error, a historical injustice. Now, he's not going to abandon these sort of massive goals just simply for economic reasons. It has to be military, and he has to feel that he's facing serious military threats. So, we need to look at how to increase that military pressure on Putin without obliging the West to engage in sort of risky behavior as they see it, which is going to draw them into a war with Russia, because that's what they're afraid of. And they're not going to do it. We could talk about that, but it's pointless because they're not going to do it. We know that. So we need to look at how that can be done. Now, I would say a very good indicator that we have just this last month or so is the success that Ukraine's been having with long distance strikes inside Russia against all the refineries and other aspects of Russia's energy industry. That's already having an impact. That's already leading to fuel shortages in a number of regions in Russia. There's been reports that's now reaching Moscow in recent days, and that's based almost exclusively In fact, as far as I'm aware, exclusively on the use of Ukraine's own domestically produced long-range drones and perhaps some missiles, but a very limited number. Now, Ukraine's producing more of those missiles now. They've recently showcased or presented some other cruise missiles that they're working on. There's going to be ballistic missiles, we're told, coming down the line. So that can have a big impact on Putin, I think, because one of the key things is to bring this war into Russia and to disrupt Russia's ability to wage war. It disrupts the war machine, as it were, the economic side of it, but also the logistics of the Russian war machine. Ukraine is already doing that itself, but the West can support that more. They can give them weapons, and they can also help Ukraine produce the weapons. So, I mean, these areas have not been developed much. On the contrary, we had for the first 3 years of the war, more or less, we had the Americans first and foremost, but others as well, saying, you can't hit Russia, you can't bring this into Russia. So Russia was a safe haven for Putin and for the entire Russian military. And Ukraine's already facing overwhelming odds. It's already a David fighting a Goliath. And when you say to them, oh, by the way, you can't hit back against Russia inside Russia, I mean, it really becomes almost absurd. And that's so there's a lot that can be done that hasn't been done yet, that we need to explore and look at ways of doing it that are that are gonna hurt the Russians. And I think we shouldn't overestimate how strong Russia is militarily. Russia can be hit hard, and when they are hit hard, Putin has shown many times in Ukraine that he's ready to retreat. He's retreated many times. The Black Sea Fleet being the obvious example, but there are others as well where he's been hit hard, he's suffered, and rather than escalate with make good on his nuclear threats, he withdraws. So I think fundamentally we've got to look at the military solutions here.
Now, you mentioned that Putin is fighting a historic campaign. That makes it seem like something he's not going to back away from easily. So despite that, you think there is a possibility here that enough pressure could be added to where he actually would say enough already and find some way to kind of piece together a peace deal, maybe?
Well, I mean, he's very much a sort of man on a mission. It's an historic mission for him. This is what he's all about. You look at Putin's entire reign. He's been in power 25 years now. And since the very early stages, Ukraine has been an absolute obsession for him. This idea that he must reverse Ukraine. This goes back to 2004, at least, when he came down to Ukraine, tried to basically impose a pro-Russian president on Ukraine, and Ukrainians rebelled against that, and they had the Orange Revolution of 2004, and that was really a watershed moment in Russian-Ukrainian relations. And it was very much Putin's thing. He provoked it. He personally came to Kiev on the eve of the election and basically told the Ukrainians, "This is the guy. Vote for this guy." And people, there was a huge pushback against that. It was the first time, I was here at the time, it was the first time you really saw a lot of ordinary people engaging in politics and really resenting Russia's sort of overbearing role here, sort of imperial ambitions. Things rolled on from there, and Putin has been very, very committed to taking back Ukraine and to forcing Ukraine back into the Russian orbit ever since. And the more Ukraine has resisted, the more violent this process has become. So we've gone from a lot of political pressure, a lot of economic pressure, huge informational pressure, right up to the 2014 invasion of Crimea and East Ukraine. Even when that didn't work, then we got to 2022 and we have the full-scale invasion. And here we are. So this has been an escalating campaign of Russian aggression, which has been absolutely central to Putin's foreign policy, arguably even his domestic policy, and it's really dominated his reign. It's the thing that he will be probably most associated with historically. So yeah, he's very, very disinclined to say, okay, enough. The only thing that can convince him to do that, I believe, is if the cost of continuing with this means he's putting Russia itself at risk. He's putting his own regime at risk in Russia. Now that is not as far-fetched as it might sound. I think we only have to look back to the Wagner mutiny of 2023 to see, how that might play out. When that happened, that was a very brief incident. It only lasted 48 hours approximately. In the space of, in that very short space of time, we saw that a group of disgruntled Russian soldiers were able to seize a major Russian city without any resistance. They were able to march on Moscow with very, very little resistance. And the people in Moscow and all over Russia nobody rallied to Putin's side. Nobody rallied to his side. Nobody rallied around the flag. There was no great surge in patriotism. People sat back and said, well, let's wait and see. Some people openly fled. A lot of people were kept very, very quiet. And then they were able to broker some sort of deal. And eventually, obviously, Putin was able to re-establish control. But it was a shocking episode that really underlined the fragility of the Putin regime and more broadly, the fragility of Russia itself. So I think, if the Ukrainians are given the tools to finish the job, if they're given more military support, if they're able to strike further inside Russia, they're able to disrupt Russia's economy, the war economy and the war machine, the logistics, Putin might start thinking, this is looking very bad now. This fragile empire that he holds could be under threat. And at that point, he may well say, it makes sense for me actually to at least step back from this invasion if I'm risking, everything, basically. Unless we get to that point, I don't see him stopping. Certainly at the moment, he's not inclined at all to stop, as we see. I think the only way to get where we need to be is by putting big question mark over the future of Russia itself.
Well, I appreciate you doing this bit of an exercise here, Peter. I hope I brought up, I'm trying to think of all the comments I see and pushback in different videos and posts about the peace process. And I think we went through a couple of those, and I learned a lot from you in kind of your explanation of some of that. So thank you very much for kind of walking through it in that manner. Is there a good place for people to find you, follow your work?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd follow the Atlantic Council's coverage. We publish articles almost every day, certainly every week, and I'm posting there at the Business Ukraine site on Business Ukraine account on social media as well. But yeah, just please, I would say follow me by all means, but I would say, my main message would be please follow Ukraine. Don't forget about Ukraine. This war is very, very far from over. It has huge implications for the future of international security. And I know people are jaded. God knows people are jaded here in Ukraine itself. But this will decide how we all live going down. So for years and years to come. So please stay engaged.
Great message. Thank you again very much, Peter.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
So thank you again so much to Peter for taking the time to walk through all of that. I do want to stress that 1 minute before we hit record, I said, hey, I have an idea to maybe do this a little bit differently. What if I push and prod in some of these areas that I see popping up in comment sections? And I think sometimes these points are raised not in good faith. Other times I think they are genuine questions. But I felt like it would be a good exercise to kind of take those head on and address those points of contention. So hopefully you found some value here. I learned a lot from Peter, of course, incredibly smart, incredibly articulate. Be sure to follow all of Peter's work in the description below. That's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.